So friends, I would like to welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Mr. Paul Hanley, and the participants in today's lecture for this latest in our series of lectures on themes related to development, the series which is called Dialogues on Development, which is organized by the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development at Devi Ahilya University, Indore. Today's lecture is on the theme, how will we feed 11 billion people? UN projections show that global population is reaching 11 billion, and the world economy will grow by 500% by the end of the century. But can the planet accommodate more than 3 billion additional people and a five-fold economic expansion when humanity's current ecological footprint already exceeds the Earth's biocapacity by 60%? Of special concern is the growing demand for food and the problem of sustaining agricultural resources. In this lecture, Paul argues that solving this conundrum will require an ethical revolution that will wholly transform humankind, reshaping its inner life and external conditions. This process will result in the emergence of a new culture, a new agriculture, and ultimately a new human race. Just a few words of introduction to Paul before I hand over to him to share his comments. Paul Hanley has published 6 books and 1,600 articles on the environment, sustainable development, agriculture, and other topics. He is the editor and co-author of Earth Care, Ecological Agriculture in Saskatchewan and The Spirit of Agriculture. He was environment columnist with the Saskatoon Star Phoenix from 1986 to 2016. His book 11 received the 2015 University of Saskatchewan President's Award for Nonfiction and the 2015 ABS North America Award for Distinguished Scholarship. Paul's biography, Man of the Trees, Richard St. Barbe Baker, the first global conservationist, features a foreword by His Royal Highness Prince Charles and introduction by Jane Goodall. His latest book is Richard St. Barbe Baker, Child of the Trees, which is part of the Changemaker series from Bellwood Press aimed at junior youth. And Paul has received many awards, which I won't go into. You can refer to his more detailed introduction in the background note that we circulated. It's a great pleasure, Paul, to welcome you to this series, and we thank you for taking your time and putting in effort to share your thoughts with us today. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Arash. Really appreciate that introduction. And it's an honor for me to be visiting India by the magic of Zoom, all the way from Hawaii. I lived my whole life up until recently in Canada, in the prairie region of Canada, a big agricultural region, but moved to Molokai with my wife in Hawaii a couple of years ago. So having a very different kind of experience here, but very interested still in what's going on here with agriculture and environmental issues. I can't see everybody, but I know you're out there. I can see there's participants, and perhaps later we'll have a chance for some discussion. But I'll share a few ideas with you now. I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint, so I'll just share my screen and take it from there. So it's a big question. How do we feed 11 billion people? And I'm going to take a kind of a maybe an unusual approach to this by looking at the bigger questions of, I guess, how do we create a just and sustainable planet? And I'll come back to the agricultural aspect as we move forward through this presentation. As Arash mentioned, I was an environmental journalist, and by around 2014, I'd written somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 articles for our newspaper in Saskatoon, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix. And I guess I was really struck by both the breadth and depth of the problems that we face as a society, environmental problems, but related and wider social problems, such as the agricultural issues. And I started to really think about the origins of our present world order, our present system, and how it's sort of born out of our worldview, our values, our way of thinking. And I realized that, we really have to examine much more broadly and deeply the human factors that influence food systems, and look towards transformative, systemic change. And this transformation really has to affect both our external conditions, but also our inner lives as well. So I was quite interested in the work of the economist Herman Daly, who talks about our transition. Really, so many of the environmental issues we're facing and resource issues we're facing are about a transition from an empty world, in other words, a world that's relatively speaking empty of people and our things, to a full world. And just a world where there are so many people and so much of our build out of infrastructure and of all of our products. So this had a big effect on me. And looking at the statistics, we see this move from an empty to a full world has happened really quite recently. So it took some 10,000 generations for the human population to hit 1 billion people around 1800, but then only 6 generations for the next billion people to be born in 1925, then 2 generations for the next billion, and less than 1 generation to hit 4 billion. And then each of the additional billions are happening very, very rapidly. So this is kind of a sudden, in a historical perspective, a sudden rapid expansion in the world's population. And the population of people is just one aspect of this. Perhaps more significant is the population of all the things that we produce and that we rely on, such as livestock, which outnumber us about 3 to 1. The massively exploding population of consumer goods, and about $20 trillion, about a quarter of our gross world product going to consumer goods for the richest 20% of the population. All the buildings that we have, all the materials, the concrete that goes into them, the energy that's needed to light them, to heat them, to cool them, and this energy taking something the equivalent of something like 35 billion barrels of oil a year, and it's becoming more difficult to find these energy sources. So we're starting to see situations like the one you see in this picture in Canada in the oil sands, where we're having to really dig very deep to find our energy supplies, and it costs more and uses more energy to find them. So when I wrote the book in 2014, there were about 7.2 billion people, and we were already overshooting Earth's biocapacity, its ability to support us, by about 60%. So since I wrote the book, there's something like 7 or 800 million more people. We're just about to hit the 8 billion mark. So we need the equivalent of the annual renewable biocapacity of 1.6 Earths to support our current levels of consumption and emissions. And of course, we only have one Earth. So we're starting to draw down our natural capital. And we're starting to see the impacts of this in things like these natural, what they call loss events. And in 2015, we passed 1,000 of these major loss events, events which cost the economy hundreds of millions, or if not billions of dollars. And you can see that most of the events are meteorological, hydrological, or climatological, so clearly impacted by climate change. And in this case, the poor are disproportionately impacted in almost all cases. But the thing that really got me when I was working on the book 11 is how I realized how we've only just begun this human project of expansion. And if you look at the question of population, which is shown in this graph on the red line, we're going from, in the year I was born, around 2.5 billion people, heading towards, the UN projection is around 11 billion people at the end of the century, when the population should start to level off. And along with that, the gross world product, everything that we produce, the value of everything we produce, going from somewhere in the $4 or $5 trillion when I was a baby, heading up, today to somewhere around $80 trillion, $80 trillion US in 1990 dollars, and heading up to something like $250 trillion. So this massive expansion of the economy expected still in this century. And along with that is the ecological footprint, the blue line. So if everything unfolds as the projections show, we would hit the equivalent of 5 Earths required to support our economy at that time. So obviously that can't work, and we have to somehow get back to this point, back in around the middle of the 1970s, when the economy was much smaller. We were using the equivalent of 1 Earth's resources. But we have to do that while supporting all these extra people. Now, one of the implications of this massive growth in the economy and our impacts on the ecosphere are the explosion of many, many different risks happening simultaneously. Risks in areas like food crisis and water crisis, certainly extreme weather events, but also in other areas in political stability, governments failures, unemployment, social issues, information breakdowns, and so on. So multiple different problems occurring simultaneously. And I think food systems have to really be considered in the larger context of the forces shaping society. Now, the common way we look at these issues around food and food systems is to really look at the idea of increasing productivity. So we say, let's deploy more technology to increase productivity. However, we're also seeing more and more adverse social and environmental consequences of doing that. But the strange thing is we keep talking about the solution is actually deploying more technology to increase production. So we have this comic look at this from there's a magazine they call Popular Mechanics, looking at a futurist magazine, and the idea of, in the future we would have these giant cobs of corn and gamma ray sprays and walking cranes to pick up the corn and so on. So it's a comic thing, but it kind of shows the idea of how we're seeing that the solution is more and more application of technology. And the idea is that we should emulate the Western productivist model. so that, it's the most successful in terms of supplying plenty of food to everybody all the time, or it has been up until more recently. So this is something that happened to me in March of 2020 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where I was living at the time. COVID was just getting underway, and my wife and I like to bake, so we went into the store to pick up some wheat flour, and there wasn't any flour, there wasn't any kind of flour, there wasn't any yeast, and so something had really dramatic had happened to supply chains. And this was something that was really extraordinary, because in Saskatchewan, where I lived, we produce about 500 million bushels of wheat a year, something over a ton for every single person. So where was this wheat? Obviously, it hadn't disappeared. Well, it turns out that minor changes in the supply chain through the illness of supply workers and slight increase in demand and so on can actually disrupt these systems. So I think in the Western world, in a place like Canada where I grew up, we're used to thinking of problems, major societal problems occurring in places like Asia, like this picture in Syria, a Palestinian camp, and the incredible disruption in these people's lives through war and conflict. But now, for the first time, we were starting to see these kind of breakdowns in society occurring right in Canada and throughout the industrial world. So things like forest fires and were spreading. There were thousands of forest fires going on in Canada. And now people like in the city of Fort McMurray and the tar sands in northern Canada, the entire city had to be abandoned because the city was on fire. So these are the people who were driving out trying to get to safety and joining something like 65 million social and environmental refugees around the world, getting a taste of what it's like. So there are many warning signs that we were experiencing. The global pandemic itself, how a disease can spread throughout the world so quickly, resulting in supply chain failures, labor shortages, transportation system failures that are happening today in the airline industry, for example, conflicts breaking out in a place like Ukraine and the impact that has on global food supply, nuclear risks returning, inflation, and these incredible climate extremes that are being experienced all over the world, from China to Brazil to Europe and certainly the United States. So we're experiencing more of the systems which we had thought were very dependable, very productive, are actually quite fragile and brittle systems. And there's a real problem with lack of resilience. So we're beginning to see these signs of what's called synchronous failure, where the systems become overloaded and perhaps multiple systems become overloaded at the same time, creating multi-systemic crises. And that seems to be underway in the world today. And this is certainly leading us to have very pessimistic views of the future, and more in our literature and our entertainments, films, and so on. We're seeing these dystopian futures, which I think are a sign of that deep pessimism that is even held by our leading scientists, people like Martin Rees, who wrote this book, Our Final Century, and questioning, will the human race survive the 21st century? Some scientists are even saying, no, that's not even possible. So there's this real sense of doom and gloom. And in that case, where do we look for signs of hope? Well, one thing is found in ecology in something called the Panarchy model. This theory is quite interesting because it talks about transformation being inevitable in any complex system. So this is focused more on ecology, let's say forest ecosystems, grassland ecosystems. But the authors of this theory say it also applies to complex systems like human civilization. So there's these 4 stages. one of growth, conservation, of building up, amassing material in the system, and then that creating conditions which cause a release and a reorganization. So there is this sense of the inevitability of change, that change will come, which is hopefully can occur in a positive way. And actually, there are hopeful signs everywhere. Even though we're kind of overwhelmed by all the negative signs, if you look, you can find many positive signs everywhere. Things like farmer-managed natural regeneration in Niger, a very innovative system, very low input, which is actually helping to restore millions of acres in the Sahel region. And figures like Edward L. Wilson, who's one of the people that really has been alerting the world to the seriousness of environmental problems, the loss of biodiversity and so on. He has this interestingly positive view of the potential of human beings. We have enough intelligence, goodwill, generosity, and enterprise to turn Earth into paradise, both for ourselves and for the biosphere that gave us birth. We can possibly accomplish this goal by the end of the present century. So strangely hopeful coming from someone like him. And he talks about this being an unprecedented time in human history, and laid before us are new options scarcely dreamed of in earlier ages. They empower us to address with confidence the greatest goal of all time, the unity of the human race. And Wilson talks about really the dysfunctions that we're experiencing right now are really a condition of the youthful state of global civilization. So we're in a period of youth or adolescence, which is often a period of turmoil, moving into a period of maturity, but we're not there yet. We are seeing signs that we're growing up, signs of the gradual emergence of a unified global civilization, somewhat under the surface. Things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of our greatest achievements. And we're seeing the reflection of this unity of building in the emergence of ecological awareness. So we see the right to a healthy environment expressed in 100 national constitutions, and most of the UN members talking about the right to a healthy environment as a human right. We're seeing things like the Earth Summit, the Millennium Summit, climate summits, all of which are starting to build a global consciousness about the need for change. And we are seeing regenerative approaches to regenerative agriculture and so on proposed as solutions to climate change and poverty. And many people have been there very early on. People like Richard St. Barbe Baker, Arash mentioned, I'd written his biography. So 100 years ago, looking at all these issues that we're facing today, seeing what's coming and expressing alternatives and taking action to bring about change. He, for example, proposed this Great Green Wall to be built across the Sahel region of Africa, across the entire continent. Everybody thought he was crazy, but it turns out today, efforts are being made to build that Great Green Wall. And young people are being inspired, people like Felix Finkbeiner and a little boy who promoted tree planting amongst children is now leading a movement to plant 1 trillion trees. We're seeing a movement from people moving from being consumers to prosumers. So rather than just consuming resources, starting to generate their own energy, their own food, their own transportation, so on. We're seeing developments in urban design. We're seeing developments like carbon neutral neighborhoods being created in different parts of the world. And we're seeing a resurgence of urban gardening and urban farming in many places. And there's estimates that something like 800 million people are involved in this type of transformative change. Even whole nations are changing with certain levels of success, trying to change energy systems. And huge investments going into renewables even more than into fossil fuels. So we are seeing these positive signs of change. And I often say that everything that needs to be done to make an 11 billion world just and sustainable is being done somewhere successfully already. So we're seeing, in a sense, two processes happening at the same time. We see all these negative impacts from the type of economy we've developed, causing a kind of a disintegration of the system. But we're also seeing people rising to the challenge and creating integrative processes. So there are signs of concern and even despair, but there are also signs of hope. And I think behind these is perhaps a competing perception of human nature and our purpose. In one narrative, we see ourselves locked in a competitive, materialistic struggle for survival. In the other, we see ourselves as one united human race building a just and sustainable world, one that is in harmony with the ecosphere. And in a way that I think that our values, the stories we tell about the nature and purpose of human life are determining the path that we follow. Which of those two approaches are we going to take? And I think behind this is the idea that the ecosphere, the realm of life and the surface of the planet, is increasingly shaped by the noosphere, the realm of mind. And human beings have become, through this, the use of the mind, have become the most significant transformative force on the planet as we enter what some scientists are calling the Anthropocene. And we can see that incredible dominance of the human species in the ecosphere through images such as this one, which shows the Earth's land mammals by weight. Human beings, the dark squares, are pets and livestock, the light gray squares, and wild animals, wild mammals. Now, just the green squares. So really, you can see the level to which human beings are taking control of the planet. So thinkers are talking about this idea of how we can change reality by changing our thoughts. And people like Vladimir Vernadsky, the Ukrainian theorist and ecologist, talked about reality being a product of focused human attention and how powerful human consciousness is as a force. That our predicament, in a sense, results from focusing our attention on material development, whereas refocusing on higher order ideals will create a new type of reality. So with collective focused attention, we alter the ecosphere. And our thoughts shape our reality quite literally. The outer world becomes a reflection of our inner world. So the ecologist Stan Rowe talked about the idea that the landscapes of our making match and reflect society's cultural inscapes. And Shoghi Effendi talked about the same idea, how we're organic with the world, our inner life molds the environment, and also deeply affected by it. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of how this is literally true. This is an image of the province I lived in, Saskatchewan, an area that wasn't developed for agriculture because of the terrain. But this was a landscape that was modified by the indigenous people, by the indigenous mind. They did a number of things to modify it through hunting pressures, fire, and so on, but they didn't change the ecological principles by which the system operated. Now, the colonial mind, the colonial mentality moved into the area, and they actually, through their thinking, their values, their worldview, actually reformed the entire landscape. Now, when I came to Hawaii and to the island of Molokai, I found the same thing, really. This is Ahu Pua'a, which is a system of agriculture that goes all the way from the top of the mountain down to the sea and into into human-made fish ponds that go out into the sea. And there was a very careful balance of agroecological development throughout these landscapes, and a very advanced form of agriculture. But the impact of the colonial mindset on this landscape and on the indigenous systems completely changed it. So today, none of those systems exist anymore, and we just see these eroded landscapes. So this is just an idea of how much our mindset can actually change the landscape. Unfortunately, we're seeing people today, such as these young people, helping to try to rebuild these systems. So I had two concepts I developed in the book 11. One was the idea that uniting humanity will heal the planet. That this is the first priority, is bringing people together. The idea is that the state of the ecosphere is a reflection of the human condition. So in a sense, we're experiencing a social rather than an environmental problem. And the corollary of this is that healing the planet is a way in which humanity can become united. Now, I think in the transformative processes we need, the political approach is appearing more and more inadequate. The partisan political approaches that we have today in governance is failing to solve these problems. What we really need is transformation on an unprecedented scale. We need really to look at building a new type of culture, a new agriculture, and essentially, ultimately, a new type of human race. And to do this, what I think we need is a moral or ethical revolution. So what do I mean by that? It seems that so much of what we do, so much of what we value is actually somewhere between, on a continuum between useless and destructive. So there are many things that we have which are completely unnecessary, like high levels of consumption that have been shown not to really produce happiness after a certain level. Frivolous things, useless things like militarization and destructive behaviors like addictions. So much of our value system is built on this kind of continuum. And we see, for example, if you look at how our values are expressed in money, and in this case, really wasted money, wasted resources. So much of it from our vices like gambling, prostitution, pornography, 600 billion US dollars spent every year, to all forms of entertainment, illness care, defense spending, alcohol, corruption, and the big daddy consumer goods for the top 20% of the population. You can see that almost half of the world's gross world product is, in some senses, wasted. So what if we flipped our value system? How would this have an effect on releasing our wealth for productive things? For things that are transcendent, what if we valued these things, our inner life, our relationships, our spiritual values, the values of service, ecological restoration, and meeting basic human needs? And these other unnecessary and destructive things kind of fade away. And this would create a value system for a full world. So right values help us focus human attention on unified action. And ideas that we have can actually transform our landscape. I've shown how we've transformed the landscape in negative ways. Now let's look at, I'd like to share this one short video about how China is bringing together ideas that are actually changing the landscape on a large scale in positive ways. And in this video, we see a filmmaker go in and film a large area of the Lost Plateau in China, and then come back 10 or 15 years later, and we see him pan over the same scenes and see what's happened. So share that.
China's Lus Plateau is a region that stretches for 640,000 square kilometers across north-central China. Unspoilt valleys in neighboring Sichuan show us how it might once have looked. It's the sort of natural abundance that is necessary to support an emerging civilization. How could a landscape with such potential have been reduced to this? When Chinese scientists and civil engineers began to survey the area, they realized that several thousand years of agricultural exploitation had denuded the hills and valleys of vegetation. The relentless grazing of domestic animals on the slopes meant that there was no chance for young trees and shrubs to grow. The rainfall no longer seeped into the earth, but simply washed down the hillsides, taking the soil with it. Over millennia, this progressively destroyed the region's fertility. When this happens over an area as extensive as the plateau, millions of tons of silt are swept down into the Yellow River. When I first filmed Mr. Ta Fuyuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land.
So, yeah, very encouraging. The potential for people becoming united, all the protagonists in society, individuals, communities, and institutions, and building a new environment around them based on positive concepts and ideas and values. So collective focused human attention, unity of thought and action can actually move the world. So this idea of raising human consciousness is so important, and Arthur Dahl from the International Environment Forum talks about this. The preservation of the environment requires not only new technologies, but also a new consciousness about ourselves and our place in the world. This is what we're up against, a complete reconceptualization of our relationship with nature and the relationships that sustain society. So let's get back to agriculture now and transforming our food and agricultural model. One of the key things I think is looking at the central role of agriculture of farmers and villages rather than technologies and production, productivist values. We have to realize that 1/3 of humanity, about 2.5 billion farmers and their families derive their livelihoods from agriculture. And that many of these farmers are small-scale farmers, smallholder farmers. And a lot of the people derive their subsistence from forests, including 60 million indigenous people, people involved in fisheries and agriculture, and that there are still millions of villages in the world, and as many as 800 million people are involved in urban and peri-urban food production. So a refocusing, I think, on the role of the farmer, the producer, and the rural community and villages. So when we're trying to build a new model, a new society, I like this expression from Buckminster Fuller: you never change things by fighting the existing reality to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So I've been trying to put together many of the things, don't worry about trying to read this, but many of the elements that would compose a new model. And they came out with just over 100 different things that would be required to create the kind of system change that would create a food system that was sustainable, just, and equitable, and nourishing. So there's elements that involve communities, individual capacity building, sustaining an ever-advancing civilization, and creating a just world order. So in terms of building capacity in individuals, you can't have a system that's so good, so well designed that people within it don't have to be good. So really building through education, through moral, ethical, as well as material development, people with the kind of values, qualities, virtues, and capacities that can underlie this system change that we need. Building unified and prosperous communities at the village and neighborhood level, a global food system built up from these local and regional communities that have achieved a high degree of food security and sovereignty is essential. This involves recognizing the station of farmers, building grassroots and consultative processes, nonpartisan governance models, gender equity, and building new types of village and neighborhood institutions. We're talking about sustaining an ever-advancing civilization. Everything we do must be informed by the fact that civilization ultimately depends on the viability of natural systems. And in thinking about this, I think we really have to look at recognizing the intrinsic value of nature as actually as a spiritual principle or a moral principle. Humanity should be understood as the trustees of the ecosphere, and we should recognize that nature itself has rights. And finally, in some ways, the most difficult things, building a just and equitable world order that's built on establishing forms of democratic global governance appropriate to an interdependent and highly connected world, one that's built on the recognition of the oneness of humanity, nonpartisan approaches, demilitarization, and redistribution of wealth. So I'm almost finished my presentation. I wanted to talk about a couple of examples of how many of these concepts were put into practice. And this is a new book I'm working on about a village in Jordan called Adasiya. And I find it a very interesting example for our times. We can see many of the elements of the transformative model that were put into practice there. Educational systems to build capacity in all age groups, including moral capacity, spiritual and material development. So the community was focused on really recognizing spiritual values and finding ways to build them, the virtues of trustworthiness, cooperation, and so on, were kind of built into their educational system from childhood up. And also regenerative agroecological farming methods that provided ecological and climate services. In about a 10-year period, this village was formed in around 1908. And within 10 years, they had built up enough capacity to help prevent mass starvation in portions of Palestine in World War I. And this is just a kind of a testimonial from the early kibbutz movement in Israel, who went to visit visit the friends in Adasiya in 1941. And they talk about the incredible beauty of the gardens and vineyards. Most of the land is planted with gardens, an orchard of pomegranates of various varieties. Really a kind of almost a paradise that they saw built into this community. And in fact, it became a model community in Jordan. The king of Jordan used to fly in his helicopter and stay with people in Adasiya, bring in delegations from people around the world to see this beautiful, beautiful village. This is a project I'm involved with in Saskatchewan, where we're trying to develop a prairie food system vision that's quite different from what the colonial model that had been built there over the last 150 years. We call it Kweyasgastaswan Wakotuan, which is the Cree, the indigenous language, and it means creating a new system that's fair by recognizing the interrelatedness of all things, people and the landscape. So this takes advantage of the concept of treaties that have been between settler populations and the indigenous people, and really trying to create a kind of new narrative about what our society could be like. And again, we took this systems approach, built a model that involved 140 lines of action in many different areas in terms of culture, technology, diet, policy, environment, and economy, with 40 different stakeholder groups. And the way we're trying to bring this about is through the development of what we're calling solution labs or solution hubs. And we're now working with a groups of indigenous people in Canada, in Nigeria, Micronesia, Kenya, and Brazil to pilot this project to develop these systemic approaches to community development and restorative food systems. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm just going to have one more thought, and I love this beautiful goal for agriculture from Masanobu Fukuoka, the Japanese farmer and philosopher. The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings. So thank you, and hopefully we can have some time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was a really inspiring, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure all the participants have been inspired, and I'm sure they have thoughts which they are probably processing. We have the Q&A box for those who would like to share comments or ask questions. We have two right now. The first question by Lotus Mahajer asks, how can we move beyond technological advances to solve issues of food security into thinking of innovation more broadly, for example, social innovations like forms of collective action among farmers?
Well, I guess that's what my whole presentation was about, is really looking at much more broadly, moving beyond just the idea of technology resulting in more production to the type of innovations that you're talking about. The farmers working together and at the community level, farmers and non-farmers at the community level, to build kind of food systems that are generated through their own examination of reality, their own reality, and coming up with ideas, testing them, working together to make them happen, and so on.
Just to build on to her question, Paul, I was wondering if you could maybe comment a little on, how do we go from where we are now as a society? You see, in a sense, the vision is clear from what you shared. It's clear what we need to do, but then the question is, there are initiatives at micro levels, there are projects being done here and there, but then there's this question of scale, right? One justification for this, for the existing systems of our world, is that there's no, or there doesn't seem to be an easy or an immediate alternative to doing things at such large scale at a cost that is affordable and meeting the needs of such large numbers of people. So is the answer then that one, like you had that image that you, I forget the name of the thinker who said you don't fight the existing reality, you build another model. Is that what you think is the way to go? In other words, let the systems be as they are, or don't. It's a losing battle trying to change the system from within and focus attention on building something else. Or do you think something can be done that is more in between, that also engages with the existing systems and it yeah.
Well, maybe it can be a both and kind of a solution, but I think ultimately, if we're thinking in terms of kind of changing our way of thinking, our worldviews and value systems, we're going to have to see communities at the level of the village and the neighborhood engage in kind of creating their own solutions, really looking at what are our problems in our community and how can we together unitedly solve them. I kind of don't think there's any other ultimate solution. Like, I'm not saying you don't go to universities and try and come up with great ideas, or research groups, government research, or international agencies and so on. Those things can all contribute definitely to the change process. But I think ultimately, until at the level of the community, where people are in relationship with each other, and we really start to build these kind of vibrant, connected communities across borders of diversity, I don't think we'll really get the change we want, because our outer reality, our environment, is a reflection of our relationships and our inner life. So that's my thinking.
Okay, the questions are coming in fast. So the other question is, thank you for the inspiring talk. It was truly thought-provoking. Life in the city seems like it disconnects humans from nature. How can residents of cities surrounded by an urban reality ensure they remain conscious of nature and natural life around them?
Good one. Well, I think that it's possible to redesign cities, to change urban plans and make them much more connected to natural systems. And in some of my slideshows, I show some examples of communities that have, for example, one was Seoul, Korea, which was kind of this mishmash of superhighways and so on. And the mayor, who was actually an engineer who built some of those highway complexes, actually tore them out and restored this beautiful river that ran right through the city and created this linear park. And people found that the park, the temperatures, because of the tree cover and so on, were lower. People flocked into that park and were able to sort of connect in this way. So we are seeing good examples of this happening here and there around the world. And I think it's a matter of making more of it happen. But again, I think it goes back to this idea of, at the level of the neighborhood, people starting to come together and really decide what they want their community to be, and making it happen, starting at a very small scale. Let's plant a few trees, let's build a community garden, and then build forward from there.
Okay, another question, let's see, what is happening in Somalia, Afghanistan, etc., and other war-torn countries in Africa and Middle East are neglected by the whole world? And then we talk about all the ecology preservation. Do you think third world problems need more focus? In other words, are the typical problems of developing countries, do they take precedence over the more long-term goal of preserving the environment. I don't know if you can say more long-term, probably not that long-term, even in the short term, but how does one, is there a trade-off?
Yeah, well, one of the thoughts that comes to mind when I look at this question is that a lot of the turmoil that's caused in the places that are mentioned are caused by ecological disruption. So some people look at the war in Syria, which resulted in this mass migration of people, as really being triggered by climate change. And due to droughts and so on, millions of people had to move from the countryside into cities, and it caused this sort of social turmoil that resulted eventually in civil war. So I think they really go hand in hand. How do we really at the level, I think, again, of communities, a level of grassroots level, really look at how we address these issues, which actually have a big impact on generating social problems, like conflicts, and military, moving into military conflict.
Okay, let's see. Can we look at the coming into existence of large metropolitan cities and even smaller towns, viewing development in terms of mimicking these larger cities as a transitory phenomenon? The development of modern means of communication seems to have made it possible for us to live in environments that incorporate many positive features of rural life. How should we view this possibility? How helpful would it be to relocate to a place and work towards creating a system that gives back to the environment as much as it takes? So, yeah, like this question of concentration of human beings in urban centers, which across the world is now a phenomena that's visible, increasing urbanization, and that brings its own needs. So is this a transitory phenomenon, or are we, in other words, you see, part of this debate is also tied to this question of rural and urban. And so the rural as it existed in the past, or as it exists, has certain features about it which one would want to change. In the same way, one would want to make sure that urbanization as it exists today is also not taken as the example. So what do you think, like where does one find the balance? Which direction are we going, or should we be going towards?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, a thought that I have about this is that there's a lot of interesting technologies like the one we're using right now, Zoom technology, which makes it possible maybe for people to spread out a little more. There's and maybe live in rural areas, make those communities a little more populated with more opportunities, and still be connected into the national or global economy. So that's a kind of an interesting thing. When we were designing, I mean, there's this process all over the world of urbanization, the massing of people in big cities and mega cities and so on. And back in Canada, basically the rural areas are being completely hollowed out, and there's bigger and bigger farms and so on, very few of them, but larger, and people are concentrating in the cities. One of the things we talked about in our model for the redevelopment and transformation of the food system was to look at how could we revitalize all these small communities. And this was definitely one of the ideas, is that people can take advantage of remote working. So maybe there's a way to kind of create more balance between urban and rural. Another thing maybe is the idea of changing urban design so that cities are more collections of neighborhoods that are quite vital and vibrant, and maybe even self-supporting in many ways through urban agriculture. Many very interesting examples around the world of urban agriculture, even in big kind of hard industrial cities, people taking over, former wastelands that have been abandoned and turning them into parks and gardens and so on. Just some thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. Here's another question. How do we ensure that agroecological approaches do not end up becoming something only the more well-off can get involved in, like organic farming and organic products being only accessible for the elites? Oftentimes, organic agriculture has been very problematic in different ways. People are talking a lot nowadays about what happened to Sri Lanka, for example. How do we make ecologically friendly approaches accessible to all?
That's a very important question, I think, and I've definitely noticed that. I live on an island now in Hawaii called Molokai, which is quite interesting in that it's not a tourist island. Most of Hawaii is built around a tourist economy, but people here don't actually like tourism, and they're trying to preserve a more native Hawaiian culture. So they're trying to find better ways to produce their own food, have food security and food sovereignty. But I've noticed that a lot of the ways they've done this result in food that's really, really expensive. So only kind of the better off people can actually afford to buy it, the better quality food. But at the same time, I've also noticed here there's a real sharing culture. So on one level, a lot of people just share and give food to each other. There's a whole movement of people making food and selling it on the roadsides and from their homes and so on. So some interesting things developing, but I think, yeah, it is a significant issue. One piece of fruit costs $5 or something like that. It's just like it becomes crazy, and it does become an elite kind of a thing. So definitely we need to find ways, things like possibly things like community gardens and so on, where people have opportunities to grow and share food that they're producing. But yeah, big problem, and definitely something that has to be answered.
Okay, let's take another question. How do you raise capacity at the community level to discuss about farming? Seems like most farmers get their knowledge from local seed stores, who basically promote what the large companies say. How do you bring a balance of experience and technology and also build the capacity to consult? So these are very practical issues that some of our friends face.
Yeah, I know. Again, back in Canada, basically there's been a corporate takeover of agricultural extension. So this used to be done by government, and so to some degree, at least, unbiased. And now almost all the extension is done by companies that have something to sell. So it's really has a commercially driven, and so this is a big problem. It's interesting that there's also a kind of a counter movement, which is farmers as researchers, and efforts by groups of farmers to come together and share knowledge through farm field days and so on, that are led by farmers themselves. So this is kind of an alternative approach. You see it a lot in the organic farming movement, where farmers get together and consult, basically based on farmer knowledge itself, rather than going to the so-called experts or the salespeople. So yeah, I think this is a very, very big issue as well, and I agree that's a big concern.
Okay, we have another question, which is it would be very helpful if you would share examples of alternate efforts of redesigning living arrangements of human populations that try to move beyond the conventional notion of rural, suburban, or urban. I think you addressed this to some extent, but I don't know if you have any further thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting idea. And it's interesting, it's coming up in a number of these questions. And yeah, I'm going to go back to what I was saying before, which I think a real key to this is finding ways to build vibrant, interconnected communities at a smaller scale, the level of neighborhoods or villages. So neighborhoods within cities, for example, and creating consultative processes that make that kind of conversation possible within a community. So I mentioned the project I'm involved in it's now taking place it's now developing in 5 different countries, where we're creating these solution labs or solution hubs. And they're using the social innovation concepts to find ways to bring people together at the community level, not just for a one-day workshop or something, but an ongoing exploration of understanding the reality of the community at the grassroots level, building solutions together and testing them out, and then reflecting on how they work and revising them and so on. This would become like a permanent institution within a neighborhood or a village, where people have this sort of long-term commitment to resolving issues around things like food security. So I think we need kind of institutions like this developing, or agencies developing, that facilitate that grassroots type of consultation and action.
Thank you, Paul. There's another question which kind of touches on this question of the role of institutions. It says, is the decision with the community to bring about change? Will the government allow these decisions that come from the bottom, from the grassroots? How did they do it in China to save the soil? So there's this question of I guess what the questioner is asking is, how does change come in? Does one just go with grassroots? Is there something to be done at the level of the state? What about policies? Yeah, it would be helpful to hear.
Yeah, from what I know about the story of the Loess Plateau in China, this was an initiative that involved basically all levels of society, the regional government, the central government in China, but also institutions like the World Bank, international agencies. But then the question became working with local people. So local people, they don't like to be messed with, so to speak. What are you doing? It involved like having to stop allowing their animals to graze. So there had to be a way of engaging local people in the process. And the way, I guess, forward was to offer them jobs involved in the restoration. They had to start to pen their grazing animals and so on. So there's some significant changes in the way of doing things, but there had to be an incentive, and that was having opportunities to work and on the restoration projects. And interestingly, that restoration of the landscape also resulted in a lot of economic development at the local level. So people's incomes increased, not like they moved into the middle class, but they went from, they were smallholder farmers and so on with low income, but increased their income so now they can afford to get health care, to send their kids to school and so on. So there has to be, these things have to work on the level of the economy. They can't just be totally focused on restoration of the environment. They also have to work on the level of economics. So as far as I know, that there had to be this kind of multi-layered collaboration and a process of really convincing local people. But I think the fact that the environment had deteriorated so much that they were in a state of poverty gave them the incentive to engage with the other levels of society, the government levels and so on.
So maybe we take one more question. There is a question which says, I wonder if a nature or agriculture-centric view of reality would come with some of its own repercussions. I can see how that is something that would help overcome many of our present or future challenges, but I wonder if at some time it may lead to a kind of unwanted obsession, like it did when we created an economy-centric world. How does one give agriculture and nature its indispensable position without giving up the central position that knowledge must hold? So in other words, how does one make sure one doesn't now replace one problem with another and keep advancing? Because one of the themes in your presentation was to sustain an ever advancing civilization. And that clearly includes, technological advancement, but then all keeping in view, of course, the balance with nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen in communities where efforts like this are underway, and I gave the example of Adesea, is that people in the community were also very involved in education. So education became a very important part of the development process. So they wanted to educate people both spiritually and materially, but many of the people then went on to higher education and went on to serve in different areas of the country. Some may be coming back and teaching, and others moving on to other fields. So, I think often these things go hand in hand. When people get involved in this kind of approach, it involves a lot of knowledge building, and it releases wealth to be put into fields like education. So I don't know. I guess I wouldn't worry very much about that, because for one thing, it's just getting to this place where we're more ecocentric, we're more agriculture centric is going to be a long-term process that I hope we do someday make a move towards. And I think the other elements of it would probably follow in terms of knowledge building. I don't know. That's just what comes to mind for me.
Thank you, Paul. There's one last question. I know I said the earlier one was the last one, but maybe we can take this last one before we end, which basically is about monoculture. Most of our education depended on monoculture, which is technology intensive. But in order to attain a sustainable development, we need to have polyculture system of agriculture. Does this mean that the research that has taken place in the entire world about monoculture is wasted? I mean, all the knowledge that generated for the Green Revolution, you know. What about all of that? Like,
Well, I mean, probably certain things have to be abandoned, but what I'm seeing when I look at some of the research institutions now that are at least the ones that are led by universities and government and so on, is you're seeing more and more efforts to look at things like building polycultures, like intercropping plants, planting legumes in with grains and so on, finding alternative ways to build more diverse, more complex systems that in some ways mimic nature. So there are definitely some people, outliers out there, who are building, you know, these permacultures and so on with dozens of species. But I think even in the kind of more conventional research establishments, they are looking at moving in that direction. So I'm sure they're using the knowledge that they already have, the knowledge base they already have, and finding how can we adapt it to incorporate more of this vision of a agricultural system that mimics in some ways natural systems.
thank you so much, Paul. This was a very enlightening address. And also, I'd like to thank our participants who joined us and for all your comments and questions. We will keep the space, the online space, open for another 10 minutes. If Paul, if you would like to respond to any of the comments which have been posted. I also would like to mention that the recording of this webinar will be shared on our the Baha'i Chair's YouTube page, and it will be shared with all those who registered for this participating in this lecture. Thank you again for your
Thanks so
time.
much for having me. Thanks for having me. And I wish I was with people there and we could engage directly, but this is kind of like, on one hand, it's wonderful to be able to connect this way, but there's also a downside to it, is you don't see the faces and feel the vibes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So I'll keep the page open for another 10 minutes or so till as long as you are there, and then we will end the session. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.